Okay, well, thank you very much. It's a great honor to be here at KDI, and I thank KDI for organizing this conference. Today I'll present some ongoing work of mine with Doug Lippold. Our primary interest is FDI and trade as vehicles for international technology transfer, and the role of intellectual property rights in affecting that. FDI is an important source of capital for developing countries. It's the largest type of global capital inflows for them. Early development economists have pointed out that less developed countries have a temptation to free ride on the innovations of the North. I mean, after all, an IP system is costly. You have to allocate resources to it, so why bother? But if you think of FDI and other technology transfer mechanisms, then your thinking is altered, because not only is FDI a source of capital, but also a source of employment. It ultimately provides goods and services to the local economy, enables the transfer of knowledge, skills, management techniques. Okay? And also, FDI is ultimately a source of competition. As long as the multinationals don't increase market concentration too much, the increased competition is worthy. So what are the issues that we're interested in? Sure, the key issue is what is the relationship between FDI and other forms of technology transfer and IPRs controlling for other factors. But more specifically, to what extent can intellectual property rights induce technologically intensive technology transfers? The operative word there is technologically intensive, because not all FDI is that technologically intensive. There's a lot of FDI to create wholesale trade, where wholesale operations basically take goods that were produced elsewhere and help distribute them. Or FDI may be primarily concerned with export processing zones, where basically local countries are doing assembly, doing low value added work, and that might be it. And it could be that intellectual property rights primarily, say, bar entry. No other firm can use the two letters GM. And do this without intellectual property rights encouraging any high value added or high technological activities to occur. This kind of question especially crops up in developing countries, because among developed countries there isn't that issue. After all, if you take this sort of standard gravity model of trade, and you have two northern countries with high levels of innovation, then they'll of course attract technology trade. But what happens if one partner has this much knowledge stock and the other not that much? And so this issue of how technologically intensive technology transfers are with respect to developing countries is the key issue. The other two issues that we're interested in addressing is, well, to the extent that technological transfers are technologically intensive, to what extent can they contribute to local innovation? For example, FDI and imported machinery may be inputs into local innovation. Yes. And indirectly, therefore, we could use that to assess how technologically intensive FDI has been, if it can stimulate local innovation. And thirdly, to the extent that FDI leads and other transfer mechanisms lead to increased innovation and productivity, production, well, that could also affect the capacity of the host country to eventually export themselves. After all, exports are just excessive production over domestic absorption. So could it be that in the longer run, host countries themselves can acquire the capacity to themselves engage in outward technology transfers? Okay, as background, Article 66 2.2 of TRIPS specifically mandates that technology transfer occur. Okay? The specific wording, if I can remember, is that developed countries shall provide incentives to enterprises and institutions in their territories for the purpose of encouraging and promoting technology transfers to less developed countries. And the WTO in 2001 affirmed that this article is mandatory. It's an obligation. And in 2003, developed countries were required to submit annual reports on the progress of assisting technology transfer. Of course, compliance is subject to interpretation. Okay. One of them is, how do you define technology transfer? Well, specifically, technology transfer can involve imports of industrial machinery or services could include the importation of R&D and other professional services, royalties and licensing contracts, and of course FDI. FDI is especially useful because a lot of services are non-tradable, and so FDI is an indirect mechanism for exporting services that would otherwise not be able to cross borders. Okay. So just looking at a few trends in technology transfer. This is our chart which you have in the paper. Essential thing is that as far as technology transfers are concerned, most of it is between north and north, not between north and south. But in terms of the growth rate of technology transfers, the south is experiencing increased percentage growth in inward FDI as well as imports of merchandise and services. This is the composition of merchandise imports, and especially identifying what types of goods are more or less high-tech, like pharmaceuticals, chemicals, and electronics, and so forth. But what's a little more interesting would be the breakdown of FDI by sector. Now, I only have this available for U.S. Multinationals. U.S. multinationals account for about 20% of world FDI, so what you notice is this: there's a huge other. Okay, so we do have some FDI in chemicals, machinery, professional services to developing countries, but there's this 3/4 of other, and that consists of wholesale trade, holding companies, which essentially shunt FDI from one place to another. And this is a key problem when you're dealing with FDI data, by the way, is that UNCTAD, for example, will report FDI in the immediate destination, but it may not be where FDI ultimately goes. So, for example, you'll see lots of FDI going to Bermuda, Netherlands, Antilles, but eventually they'll go to Germany. I mean, maybe for tax reasons, and that's likely the reason for FDI first to go to some particular destination. So there is a disconnect between reported FDI, because we only observe immediate destinations and not ultimate. But that's correctable. You can correct that if you're working with microdata, then you can make some corrections. And this deviation between immediate FDI and ultimate FDI destination has gotten more serious in more recent years. But for the sample period that I have, probably not a big a deal. And also, I don't include Bermuda and the other sites where these holding companies exist. Okay. So before I get to the empirics, what are sort of the theoretical ideas or the conceptual framework of how FDI and IPR relate? You have on the one hand the north-south policy debate. Okay? There are critics of IP who claim that basically IPRs raise the cost of technological inputs, making it harder for developing countries to imitate. And imitation is another form of technology transfer. This is a way to acquire skills, and stronger IP could prohibit that. And then there are also advocates on the other side who say that, well, stronger IP, more stringent IP, may be a strategic tool for drawing in investment from abroad. Particularly if your own host country, if your own developing country is lacking in its own domestic ability to innovate. In that case, foreign technology is your main source. And eventually, the foreign or imported inputs could be inputs into your own domestic innovation eventually. But theoretically, the link between IP and technology transfer is a little bit more complex. And basically, it boils down to a trade-off between a market expansion effect and market power effect. On the one hand, by limiting the capacity of others to imitate or infringe, the IP rights holder has a greater ability to profit from his or her own technology transfer, and therefore should have an incentive to bring more technology. On the other hand, IPRs also increase the market power of the rights holder, and that might induce the holder to limit supply by reducing the output of affiliates or licensing contracts and exports. So this trade-off, what does it depend on? And it could depend on at least two things. One is, market size, because the larger the market, the more competitive the economy will be, and the level of competition could help to mitigate the effects of market power of IPRs. Another factor that affects this trade-off or balance between these two different forces is the imitative capacity of developing countries. If they have very weak ability to imitate anyway, then pretty much the rights holder already had de facto protection. Okay? So all that IPRs would do would be just to enhance the market power effect. So the theory predicts that IPRs would largely positively stimulate technology transfers in larger markets where there's already lots of capacity to do research anyway. Another theoretical area of the literature is this ownership, location, investment business literature of Dunning. I regard that affecting more the composition of technology transfer rather than the overall level. But I think that's very important, especially with regard to assessing empirical work, because say that you see a study which finds a negative effect of IP on exports. Well, that doesn't mean much, because it could be that there was a substitution from exports to FDI. Or if you again find a negative relationship between FDI and IPRs, it could be that, well, firms reduced their FDI and chose more licensing. So it's useful to look at this as a whole. And where OLI comes in is, for multinational firms to enter a market, they face a disadvantage. And so what they need is an offsetting, compensating factor, which is maybe superior technology, right? And that the location is, okay, so what's good about the location? Why can't I just export? Why should I go in and set up a subsidiary? Well, maybe they have lower factor costs. Or maybe they have stronger IP. Okay, so that IP could influence the margin at which you choose exports versus FDI. And then if you think of a thermostat, okay, as you strengthen IP even further, firms may, when the thermostat is somewhere in the middle, then you prefer to keep your technology in-house. But then as the thermostat of IP strength rises, firms will be willing to take on more risk of transferring technology to an unaffiliated arm's length licensee. Okay, so again, that could affect the margin. So the overall point is that it would be useful to look at both the volume as well as the composition of technology transfers and how IP affects that. In the interest of time, I won't go through all the key papers that I'm aware of over the past 15 years. I'll just get directly to the gaps in the literature. Essentially, the results are mixed. Whether there's a positive, negative, or insignificant relationship depends a lot on the nature of the evidence. The primary gaps are, on the one hand, most of these studies, including the one I wrote, looks just at one mode. Okay? So both Brandstetter and I, we both use licensing data. We didn't look at, we didn't control for FDI or trade. Another is that some studies look at the volume of FDI, others look at location choices. I find that the latter a disadvantage because you choose a location, but it doesn't give you the intensity of FDI. But that can't be helped. If a researcher only has that kind of data available, and that's what that person will work with. Another key criticism is that a lot of these studies were before TRIPS, like Pamela Smith, very good papers by her, were from the late 80s. Okay, so we talked about this yesterday, about structural changes, and so it would be useful to update the evidence. And next to final criticism is that some of the studies tend to lump IPRs together, not distinguishing among the different kinds we observe, copyrights, trademarks, and patents, and so forth. But the one that I'm interested in is that have we addressed the issue of how substantive technology transfers work? Okay, did IP help induce technologically intensive transfers to occur? Okay? Early work by Mansfield with his survey, very influential survey, asked businesses, firm executives, their thoughts. There are three things that I should highlight. One is that intellectual property rights matter to the function of technology transfer. Mansfield found that if the purpose is to create sales and distribution outlets, then it's not important. If you want to establish R&D facilities, then it's important. A second thing that the survey finds is that it depends on the industry. For chemicals, because chemical R&D and output are easy to replicate, whereas transportation. So as with all surveys, you kind of want to distinguish between stated preference versus revealed preference, right? Because stated preference is, firms will answer will reply to whatever your questionnaire says, but then you also want to look at their actions. Are their actions compatible with their survey questions? So that's where we come in, is we want to look at more hard data on whether or not technology transfers did involve transfers of new technology, transfers of technologically intensive technologies. Okay. So our tasks are to look at the different kinds of IP. Again, for example, Mansfield discussed intellectual property in general. We also look at data by industry, and also, the level of IPRs are highly correlated with so many other institutional factors. Okay, so the property rights in general, governance, judicial efficiency. It would be useful to control for these, because a lot of, in many cases, it might be that the intellectual property measure picks up other institutional factors. The measures of intellectual property rights are all based on statutes as well as case laws. And in addition, I'm also looking at a survey by the Global Competitiveness, actually it's the World Economic Forum, and they publish these IP surveys. They ask business executives in different countries to rate how adequate is enforcement of IP in your country from 1 to 7. Okay? I like that survey, but there are also limitations with that, especially comparing between countries. Right? Because they're not the same people who score each country. Different people rate China's IP system, and another group of people rate Malaysia's system. So if one says 3, the other says 4, how do you compare? It's not the same group of people who do this, but nonetheless they're of interest. And what you find is that mostly, as we expected because of TRIPS, developing countries are the ones that have strengthen their systems the most. And among the different kinds or different measures of IP, the one that correlates most with the IP survey is the patent rights. So even though the World Economic Forum doesn't ask the executives their opinions on different kinds of IP, probably they're thinking of, primarily patents or other rights related to industrial property. Okay, so this again shows you that most of the changes in patents, for example, occur in non-OECD countries. So the analysis that we have looks at 122 countries. Of course, there are some missing data here and there. From 1990 to 2005, we're looking at inward FDI as well as merchandise as well as services imports. And we provide different perspectives, different types of IP, different groups of countries, whether they're least developed, developing, or developed, and the different industries. Let me just provide an overview of the highlights of what we find. So essentially, these measures of technology transfer are most sensitive to patents. Okay, so it's the rights to innovation that firms appear to care about most versus, say, trade names or business expressions. But of course, we didn't really look at creative industries. I'm sure the results would be different if we had looked at cultural industries like movies, sound recordings, books, software, and so forth. Another thing that's important is the survey, that measure of enforcement perception by business executives. That's also an important factor. However, in least developed countries, that World Economic Forum measure sometimes does not appears significant. And so my interpretation would be that in certain countries, what firms would like to see is written, not just perception, but actual written commitments through legislation. Okay? And they want to see precedent that they are entitled to certain rights and provisions. Other things that we find are consistent with the theory that IP, or patents actually, have most effect on developed countries. Okay? So, for example, the elasticity of holding other factors constant, the elasticity of patent rights on technology transfer are 5 to 10 times more than for developing countries. And also developing countries, though I divided the sample into 3 groups, the developing countries are actually more heterogeneous than you think. They consist of, South Korea, but then you also have, Malaysia in there or other developing countries. So on the one hand, the developing countries do consist of Czech Republic, Hungary, and Korea, and versus. So that's reflected in how well the model fits. Doesn't fit as well as with the other 2 groups. The other thing that's also consistent with our with the theory is that for small markets, you do find a negative impact of stronger IP enforcement and technology transfer. In other words, in those environments, the market power effect tends to dominate. And also regarding the OLI, ownership location composition effects, while we didn't do a formal test, what we find just judging by the quantitative impacts, that when IP reforms take place in developing countries, there's a bigger effect, though both imports and FDI rise, it's biased more towards FDI. So more FDI comes in than imports. So this is sort of consistent with that thermostat idea where you raise the strength of patents more and you can get more FDI as a ratio of imports. And the least impact would be on services. And that's not too surprising because FDI in some cases substitutes for services. Instead of exporting your R&D consulting services, you go and set up a branch in the host country and then provide services there. So that too is not surprising. Well, the other set of investigations we do is to assess that question I raised earlier. How do we assess the technological content of technology transfers? How do we know whether they're that technological intensive? Well, there are several ways to do this. One way is to look at the results by sector. Okay, you know, in the extreme case, it might be that most of the FDI, for example, is in wholesale trade, holding companies or banks, right? But you know, even among high-tech companies, of course, high-tech sectors, there's variation in the quality or technological level of goods. But on average, you would expect them to have the production process to be a bit more complex and skill-intensive than the other sectors. A second way to assess how technologically intensive the transfers are is to look at associated variables like foreign patenting. To the extent that firms are transferring new technologies to developing countries, they might be interested in protecting it. So they would, at the same time, apply for a patent. Okay? If they're transferring old technologies, then that technology is no longer novel, and so they won't bother with a patent. But what I said has to be qualified, of course, because there might be cases where the firm doesn't need to apply for a patent because the technology is very hard to replicate anyway. Or maybe there are alternative means to protect that. Okay? They might rely on trade secrecy, copyright, or their reputation. Well, a third way to assess how technologically intensive the FDI or other transfers are is to see what impact, if any, they have on local innovation. Okay? If these host countries import technologically intensive FDI or imports, those factors in turn could be inputs into local innovation. So indirectly, we can assess the quality of the FDI. Again, the extreme case, it might be just fast foods or tourism that these FDI help to establish. I wouldn't expect those things to affect local innovation. So the bottom line is that the answers are yes, yes, yes. Okay, so we do find that IP in developing countries is associated with inflows of high-tech goods. Number two, we do observe increases in foreign patenting. And number three, we do find that these transferred technologies are important inputs into local R&D as well as local patenting. And then we supplement our empirics with some anecdotal case studies. Again, these are case studies done by others, which establish that IP has affected technology transfer, and that the technology transfer in turn affected local indigenous capacities to innovate. Okay, so these studies discuss Russia and how FDI influenced the development of their chemicals sector. In China, how R&D facilities are being set up, even though the R&D is largely experimental. Okay? In Brazil, aircraft parts and auto was something we'll talk about later with respect to Mexico, India, and software. Okay, now the next step, which this is not in the paper, this is work that I'm doing with others right now, is this, that to the extent that these inward transfers affect innovation, which is something we did discuss in the paper, and then this innovation in turn affects local production, well then this should affect the local economy's capacity to reciprocate and themselves carry out outward technology transfers. And this is consistent with the OLI framework. Again, the ownership part. Okay? If host country IP strengthens and creates innovation in the host country, well, the host country can use this innovation as a platform for exporting and for engaging in outward FDI. Yesterday we talked about Korea, and that's the case I want to use, Korea. Everyone's talked about how Korea transited from being an imitating nation to an innovating nation today, and where the break occurs somewhere in the 80s, I think. Well, this is also reflected in Korea's outward technology transfer behavior. Out of nowhere, by that I mean before the 90s, where Korea wasn't a strong presence in North America, but when I last checked in 2008, Korea was number 16 in terms of U.S. inward FDI. Of course, UK, Netherlands, Japan are up there in top 3, but Korea is number 16, which means that if you look at all the inward FDI stock created in the United States, Korea is number 16. Korea is number 11 in terms of the licensing payments that U.S. makes to foreign companies. So Korea ranks 11th. So that means that Korea long ago used to be largely borrowing technology and paying for it. Now they're at the stage where they sell and that they earn income. And the question is, well, what about the BRICS? So that's what I'll look at next. This shows you the ratio of a country's outward FDI to inward FDI. Okay? And what I did for the BRICS was just pool them together. So the numerator has all of BRICS outward FDI, and the denominator has all of BRICS inward FDI. And well, it looks like that the BRICS started off being big outward FDI activists, but that's primarily because the denominator was so small back then. Okay, but so just start your eyes with 1990, and Korea from the early 80s increased, and I believe that when it starts falling is around the financial crisis of '97. I'm not 100% sure what caused that. But anyway, after 2001, Korea's outward FDI rises again. Well, this pattern is actually clear if you look at licensing receipts. So these are licensing revenues associated with intangible property. So again, the numerator is the licensing revenues to the rest of the world divided by licensing payments to the rest of the world. So the BRICS countries, though we observed a lot of changes in the Brazil, Russia, India, China, there's still their licensing payments are under 20% of the payments that they make to the rest of the world. But if you look at Korea, this is reflected in Korea's own R&D and patenting. Right now, Korea's receipts are just 40% of payments to the rest of the world. So this shows that Korea is now selling as well as borrowing technology. Okay, to wrap up in terms of policy lessons. Sure, there's still a lot of controversy about how important IP is to technology transfer, but our study finds that that IP can stimulate technology transfers, particularly going beyond just sales and distribution, but also bringing in technologically intensive inputs. But the second lesson is that IPRs don't work alone. They work in conjunction with other institutional factors, and that IP alone would probably not be enough for developing countries to attract sufficiently important technological inputs. Thirdly, to stress how important it is also to take things in a holistic view. After all, let's look at the overall level of technology transfers and not just pieces of it. And as I said, there's a problem with only looking at one or two modes of technology transfer. And the fourth lesson is that both laws and IP resources are important. Okay? Laws because there are firms, inventors who would like to see things in writing. Okay? They want to see what their rights are in stone. Okay? But resources are also important because if you look at the most common complaint as to why there's a deviation between what the rights are according to Stone and the actual enforcement in a country, the deviation is largely due to resources. Okay? A lot of these countries don't have, they want to, they're willing to enforce IP, but they're just not able to. And so punishment is ineffective when, you know, the probability of detecting, apprehending, and prosecuting infringers is too low. Okay, thank you.